Hello, good morning, or
Hey,
afternoon, evening,
hello.
wherever you may be.
Yeah.
All right, as usual, I dropped the link to the document in the chat. I'll do that again in just a little bit. We'll give it a couple minutes for anyone else to join. If you would like to add any topics, please do so. If you cannot add anything to the topic list, then I can add it for you. Whatever works.
Hi, good morning.
Hello,
Hello.
Stephen Taylor here from SAP.
right on. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, give it maybe just another minute to fill in any topics. And then, as usual, you can add them as needed if something occurs to you. Let's see. Okay. Alrighty, so thank you everyone that's here, and welcome to the Cloud Foundry on Kubernetes Working Group Forum meeting. There is a document of topics that is going to be posted in chat once again for anyone that would like to add to it, view it, and follow along. So I've just dropped that link in chat again. If you'd like to add a topic, please do so. Otherwise, we're going to just get rolling, and we'll see where we are from that point. So looks like right now we just have the one topic, but it should be interesting, which is a CF plus Korifi POC.
My colleague Steven decided to give Korifi a try a couple of days ago, and he came up with a POC that looks awesome. So I'm glad to have him today. So Steven, please, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Love it.
Sure, ready? All right, let me share this. Tell me if you can see my screen. At least it's.
Yeah.
You see that?
Yep, I can see it.
So, I mean, I'll give you a bit of background on sort of what we were doing, sort of why I sort of stumbled on Korifi, how it helps me solve some of my problems. And then as I said, it's more around, this is extremely alphaware. I mean, this is beyond wet paint kind of like quality. So don't read anything into good, the bad, the ugly of it. It was literally hacked together over the past couple of weeks because I needed to solve a problem, and I wanted to sort of see it in a way that sort of highlights some of the benefits of what Korifi is offering, because I think it's just not clear enough yet to a lot of people, especially when I stumbled upon it, that it solved some of my things that I was actually actively looking into. So once again, this is an SAP, hacked together. Don't read anything into it. It's probably may or may not ever go anywhere. But, as I said, I'll fill you in sort of like the background. So, I mean, it all really started with a problem that we had several months ago. Was actually, going into like late last year, where we had a problem with the rate limiting on Cloud Foundry. Now, there are many ways that we saw we could skin this cat, but I mean, realistically, using, applications to limit, rate calls, or using the Go routers and services and so forth, just added more pressure onto an already heavily loaded landscape. So what we were looking at is, right, if we've got external callers coming in, could we rate limit that externally using something that was a little more dynamic than HA proxy, because, HA proxy being configuration, versus things like Istio, where we say, right, we've got inbound rules and routes and so forth. Can we then start limiting on particular URLs and then do it very dynamically? So what I did is I built up a landscape. Well, this was actually a very, very, very large test landscape that we had up in SAP, which was for another POC, which I took over. And it was really could I wrap this thing in Istio and prove that we could do things like rate limiting? So I could take a particular service, put a rate limit around a particular call, and saying when that call comes into HA proxy, or in this case, directly to Go routers, that we would then apply a rate to it. And I mean, it worked. And it proved that I could, could front the clusters with things like Istio. I'd get more of the intelligence that I needed in front of the cluster. And then I could add things, as I said, rate limiting was one of them. It could have been transformations. It could have been anything else. So then I looked at that and said, well, maybe I could do a very similar thing where I would just essentially move an application to that top cluster and use, Istio rules to route based on a particular set of criteria. So I could take an application, move it to this applications cluster, and then, call the same domain and have it route seamlessly under the covers. It's a relatively straightforward thing, seems pretty simple and pretty logical, but nobody had done it. So as I said, I was heading down this route before the Log4j bug, kicked in, sort of end of last year. That sort of put a brake on everything that we had done, and this cluster had to be terminated because it was, a compromised cluster potentially. So we put that on hold for a while, and we thought, well, okay, we'll revisit this, as we start to look for different use cases around this. And I picked it up again a few weeks ago, and I was starting to think about, well, maybe what about if I were to create some kind of API layer that would sit in front of this applications cluster that looked like a Cloud Foundry domain, but was backed by Kubernetes. So I was looking through a lot of your websites and blogs and bits and pieces, and I stumbled across, I think there was another effort to rewrite the cloud controller to Go. And in fact, that was done by some guys within SAP. So, I looked at that, and then I think buried down in one comment was this thing called Korifi. So, I mean, as I said, what I was really looking at, the goals of this particular project was, allow transparent movement between landscapes. I wanted a very frictionless developer experience because I didn't want to have the developer to have to go and relearn new tools. I didn't want them to have to go and learn new paradigms. That means breaking CI/CD pipelines. It means breaking everything. But I also wanted to modernize this under Kubernetes and Istio. So, of course, the question came up of why couldn't I just use separate clusters? Why did I need to do some magic with routing? Well, I mean, clusters, it just adds more complexity when I have different URL endpoints. I can't change that seamlessly under the covers. It got very complex. I mean, I'm not a big fan of like separate URLs and separate clusters and having different tenants live within different clusters. I prefer to have it more of a generic endpoint that I can then say, call this endpoint and I will route that for you, right? This is one of the reasons why I went with Istio, in the first place. We looked at, I have a very simple API endpoint. I call that API endpoint. I do the routing for you. And I will make, if anything goes wrong on my side, I know how to route you around it, right? So this is where Korifi sort of came in. So as I said, it solved one of my problems, which was I needed an API landscape, an API that wrapped this landscape that looked and felt like a Cloud Foundry cluster. It was, and you also backed it with, with the modern paradigms of Kubernetes. So you could create an application, deploy an application, and it would look and act like a Cloud Foundry application. And under the covers, I could then use it for things like Istio routing. I could start to build extra applications that attach to that within the Kubernetes clusters. I'm not stuck in one or the other. So it gives us that flexibility of saying it is a Cloud Foundry application. A developer doesn't need to go and change everything they need to do. They understand that paradigm. And as I said, SAP partners and customers, have spent a long time understanding Cloud Foundry, and then to go and tell them to go and rewrite their entire application suite to run on Kubernetes or run on a new platform is an extremely daunting task for them. And they, it could break anything or everything in between. So if I can keep that facade the same and let them seamlessly migrate over time to a new paradigm, it saves me, a bunch of headaches. We saw, and one of the paradigms I like to continually use is when Apple moves processors, right, and chips, you don't really have a major paradigm shift and say everybody go and do a whole bunch of different things. Apple creates the tools and the facades around your application to let you, repackage, deploy your application exactly the same way. It just runs on a new chipset, right? There's nothing that says this is a whole new direction, go and learn a whole new GUI, all the tooling, it's completely different. And go ahead and, spend the next 6 to 12 months trying to migrate your applications, right? I wanted it almost in a one-day switch for a developer, right? So this is how I technically laid out the landscape that I'm running. I'm running multiple clusters. So because we have solos, glue gateways, and glue mesh, I'm able to federate, Kubernetes clusters and Istio deployments. So what I have in this one is a gateway cluster, a lab cluster, and a management cluster. And of course, the Bosch deployment, which is running, this is all running on vSphere, by the way. So the Bosch cluster is running the Cloud Foundry deployment, which is, a basic deployment, but it is, a full deployment. What I am doing in the lab cluster is, because Korifi was failing a few times when I first set it up, I ended up running it under vCluster because I could tear it down and rebuild it in, 10 minutes versus tear down a full, Kubernetes cluster, rebuild it, set up new IP addresses, set up all of the configuration again. So, I streamlined the deployment of the Korifi cluster down into, a simple set of steps. It gives me what I need, albeit not super performant, but exactly what I needed it to do right now. So what I have done is once again install a bunch of solo enterprise agents within each one of these clusters. That helps me federate configuration down the road. And so when I change something within or deploy a particular route, within the Korifi cluster, it will propagate over to the management cluster and get picked up by other pieces. So the main pieces that I have set up, I mean, I didn't change your contour because of the complexity of it, because you've built quite heavily around contour. What I have done is I still expose it as a service endpoint with a load balance IP address. Within the inbound gateway, I do use WASM filters to change some of the authentication information, and then based on that context switch, I will actually route to either one of these clusters, right? So if it happens to be I'm talking to the Contour cluster, to the Korifi cluster, I will switch those credentials from the bearer token to the client certificate, and then I will reroute you to Contour, right? And this only routes based on the API URL, not any of the login or the UAA or any other one, but very specifically for a single API. What I do have is this tenant mapping service, which is running on my laptop, on my PC. So what it does, WASM will call out to this tenant mapper service and say, if a particular ID, I unpack the JOT, if the JOT ID says it's user X, I will then do that token switch for you. As part of also when I bring up an application on Korifi, I have a cluster update service, which is looking for your CF routes, which get propagated. And that will go and update the actual Kubernetes cluster Istio deployment, as well as update Route 53. And the reason I need to do that is because of the SNI routing, right? So if I have a particular route that gets created, I need to create a DNS entry, which points to a CNAME entry, which Glue has been added as well as a route. and that gets sent through Contour because of, once again, your CNI, your SNI routing. Contour won't take it if it doesn't present, during that TLS handshake, the actual router wants to go to. So it's a little bit of a pain, but once again, it does work. The Cloud Foundry one is just a wildcard domain. So unless it's like login.steventaylor.net or UAA or anything else, or API, it will just default everything to that Bosch cluster, right? So the way I set it up inside the routing tables within the gateway is everything by default will go to Bosch and to Cloud Foundry. And unless I've set specific rules or I'm doing dynamic routing, it will route to either one of the clusters. Does that make sort of sense? Yeah. So as I said, what I had proven, at least through the login sequence, we are, during a standard login event, it will go to the gateway. The gateway sees, okay, there's no authentication header present. We'll forward that, to Cloud Foundry. Cloud Foundry will do a standard login and return that back to the CLI. The CLI will then, follow the login sequence, which works. And then it will go down and say, all right, give me the organizations. But at this point in time, there is an authorization header. The gateway WASM picks that up and says, call out to this token exchange service. The token exchange service sees the user ID, sends back a new token, which then I will replace that in the outgoing header, and then call out to the Korifi cluster, right? Korifi responds as though you're talking directly to it, and the CF, the CLI doesn't know any different. All it's seeing is a bunch of API endpoints coming back to it, and it's able to follow the standard process, right? So it doesn't see anything different. There's nothing that seems to be broken. Now, this also works with the CF push and any other subsequent calls, even on a token exchange. If the CLI is the token has expired, it once again calls into the login service and gets a new token. So you get a refresh token. Is this all clear to you guys? Any questions so far? I know I'm going quite quick on it, so.
No, this is great. And we can always review the recording later for the finer details. So thank you.
So, what did we, what came out of it? Once again, you can log in a standard CF cluster. There's nothing that says it's special or has to do anything. Tokens are exchanged, transparently. So the WASM filter was a bit of work, but, it does its thing. It's not performant, but of course it does what it needs to do. It routes correctly to the Korifi cluster, and, every subsequent command that the CLI sends over the wire will be routed based on, that particular header. Apps, well, they shouldn't technically know the difference if, Korifi's done its job correctly. So, as long as I've got the information within the apps, it should work. The developers shouldn't see any of the routing, and it should be very seamless to the developer to continue their current workflows and their current, processes without having to do a whole bunch of extra work. So far, apps deploy and act as normal. I'm still yet to get some of the cross routing working. I have to create an application that will cross some of these routes. And once again, Cloud Foundry and CLI is, oblivious to any of the routing. It's done on, before they even know what's going on. So, I can just show you a quick demo of, show you this one. Okay, let me get rid of that. So here is, let me see if I put this in the script. So if I log in to, can you see my screen? Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway? Yeah, we do.
Okay.
Yeah, we do.
Okay. So once again, if I just do a standard login, course, now it doesn't want to work. Okay. So it just did a standard login to the Cloud Foundry application. Okay, so as you can see, this is now talking to Cloud Foundry. There was an authorization call, but it didn't do anything across it. As you can see, my application is taking a call from a WASM filter. So if I do, at least in verbose mode, sorry, it's a bit up and down right now, you will see that you are getting, WASM is being called, right? But as I said, it's talking to Cloud Foundry right now. It's not switched over. But if I do a log out and switch in to a different user, yeah. We've now switched over to the Korifi cluster. And there is a token exchange going on in the background, which is why it's much slower. And now you have a bunch of different apps which are sitting in a different cluster. This is on the Korifi cluster. Now, if I turn off the WASM and do the same call, no applications are found because now it's talking to Cloud Foundry again, right? It doesn't know any different. If I turn it back on, and once again, I could completely change this out, it will go off and call the Korifi cluster again. Albeit slowly. And once again, if you're looking at the actual applications, I mean, this is the one running on Cloud Foundry. This is the Korifi ones. They should technically, because they're on the same domain, should be able to call each other. But as I said, it's an interesting point to do some routing later on. And as you can see within, Glue Mesh, within the gateway, I have a bunch of different rules based on imported, applications, for example. And they are being, I create a destination, for a particular endpoint, and then that will be added into a route saying under certain hosts come in, do a route to a particular route to a particular destination, which happens to be your contour thing. And through that, they do the SNI handshake for TLS and gives me, once again, the ability to traverse that. Now, what would have been interesting is if I could have bypassed the whole SNI thing and just pushed it to a backend TLS or directly into the actual routing service in Korifi, then I could have done almost east-west routing from one cluster to the next. So yeah, as I said, I get the tokens in. As I said, I do a lookup on a user ID, set back, two things. One is the header, and one is just saying this is my cluster that I'm going to. And then based on routes, which will be that, there's a header rule that says reroute to a particular destination based on that header. So
how do you know which one is which? I guess based on the user, because you know how you map them, and based on the state, because the output is indistinguishable, right? It's the same, behaving the same way.
So it's purely done on the clients, on the user ID and the job. So once again, if I will just take the user ID that I have set, from the decoded JOT. I will then add this header. I will replace the header into here, and then then set the particular cluster. I mean, the actual, if you want to look at WASM,
I guess my question was more like about the user. I guess the user will have to know how these mappings are set up, because it's output is indistinguishable. It's like seamless.
Right.
And what happens if you push the same, because you're sharing the same domain? What happens if you push the same map, which would result in the same root? Do you get like some different subdomains? Have you thought about that at all?
I haven't thought about subdomains yet. No.
Yeah, okay. I guess it's a future concern because obviously they're going to somehow clash with each other right now.
It could do, yeah. I mean, right now it's as I said, it's hacked together. I mean, the WASM filter is really, the sort of core of the work of doing that routing. But to be able, once again, within WASM, to call out to an external service to make a better judgment of what to do next, right? Right now, it's brute force based on, a particular user ID. But because I know what the inbound call is, right? I know all of the information about what is, what you're trying to do. I can actually make a better decision further down the road and saying, all right, I know now what the URL, I know the subdomain, I know, potentially subpaths, and reroute based on that. I said, this was very brute force to get it to work, but it seems to be possible.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So, as you can see, simple, CF apps will get you based on a different route, and seems to work as expected. Do I know if there's probably a billion different use cases that may fail, but I don't think that it's I don't think that that's just we're probably discovering, as we sort of dig through some of this stuff. I mean, that's also not handling things like custom domains and routes and so forth. So that's kind of it as far as the demo and POC went. Questions?
I guess we would be interested in your overall experience and any kind of feedback. Like one obvious thing would be you'd probably like to put Istio in there instead of Contour, and how would that change that picture that you showed? How much more simple would that become if you can just swap that?
Yeah, the goal was in the original picture to replace HA proxy with Istio. And that would let me route directly to the Go routers. And then I could almost build in east-west routing directly from one app to Cloud Foundry, not to an application, but at least from, let's say, a Kubernetes deployed Korifi application to a Cloud Foundry cluster. Now, I don't really know what that means right now because we haven't dug deep enough into it, but it definitely looks like it has possibilities to build more intelligence about inter-cluster routing, from, let's say, one application. Could I deploy half an application on Cloud Foundry and the other half on Korifi? I don't know. I mean, it's possible. How would the routing look? That's a very good question. Service discovery is a little more tricky. How do you populate services within Istio that are deployed on Cloud Foundry and vice versa? I don't know yet.
But it will be, I guess it will be easier for you to do this if
yes,
if you're able to swap Contour for Istio.
It would be, because then I wouldn't, right, because it kind of works within the same, let's say, as we always say, it speaks the same language, right?
Yeah.
Then I don't need to have complexities such as DNS entries. I can just do a pure routing, and based on that, I could go almost directly to a service. And said I haven't, I hadn't looked into how deep that would need to be, but yes. I mean, my experience so far with Korifi, I mean, look, it's starting to solve some of the problems that, are interesting as far as routing goes, as far as building a cloud native application goes, as far as, once again, I could deploy my legacy application to Korifi and then modernize that around it over time. You know, as I said, I don't know. I mean, I like the Cloud Foundry deployment and development experience. I think it's much easier for a developer to understand how to do a Cloud Foundry application versus, you know, a pure Kubernetes and Istio. I think that a lot of developers, you know, outside of guys that really want to dig, you know, into the details, I think having a developer experience that is as simple as a CF push makes a whole bunch of sense for them. It just needs to be modernized. I think that the underlying pieces that we could have, especially if you look at things like telemetry, you know, canary rollouts, if you look at you know, failovers, HA, geo distribution, all these things could be built into the Istio layer versus, you know, the application trying to do what they need to do.
Cool. Yeah. Obviously understandable. Live demos are always fun because everything that can go wrong will go wrong. But
for some reason, Korifi is in the background trying to do something. I don't know what it's doing. It's trying to pull. I have a Harbor Docker registry set up, and for whatever reason, it's in the background pulling images left, right, and crazy and terminating things. So
interesting.
I don't know why.
Yeah. Regardless, we got to see it in action, which was really cool. So yeah.
But yes, it does work. And as I said, we are looking at, as I said, we're going to show this at least to some of the SAP folks to get more of a, as I said, I think there are just far better ways than producing tools to try and migrate people off.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, we'll definitely probably want to take another look at it later when the recording is published. But yeah, awesome demo. Thank you for that.
Of course.
Anyone else that wants to pipe up and say something, you know, you have the floor at this point. I also don't see any other topics on the agenda at this point. So if there isn't anything else that people want to talk about, let's, you know, make sure everyone gets any stewing thoughts out of their brain on the cool POC demo and flow chart we got.
And by the way, I'm in Palo Alto if you guys are, you know, in my time zone. So I mean, I know some of you guys are from VMware, so
yeah, we're kind of scattered across the globe, but there are a fair number of us that are in if not the same time zone, adjacent time zones. So
right.
Yeah, there's
Yes.
Stephen, there's still a bunch of us who are in the Bay Area even. So
Yeah.
I guess you can probably use the Slack channel. I don't know if you invited you there yet because we've been communicating via email, corporate. So I guess you can drop in the channel and ask stuff like propose, open issues, all kind of feedback is really welcome. We already created a story to look into the Istio stuff, which I don't know exactly when we're going to pick it up, but it's in our list.
Yeah, I think some of the also getting up and running as a, you know, to, you know, develop some of the code, you know, at least to spin up a developer environment to get it up and running is probably something that, you know, would be interesting to me. Yeah, at least to debug, because I said I can usually, you know, function offline most of the time. So I know there's the hacking guide, but
yeah, we're using kind deployments for local development, debugging, trying out stuff. So I guess we're constantly improving the install instructions and they're constantly breaking down. I think we're in one of these loops now and a release is pending soon. I guess pretty soon they'll be back to normal and you'll be able to, I mean, you can try them out. If you have any problems, you can drop in the channel. I'll make sure I send you some sort of a link invite. I don't know how these things work, but I'll find out.
Yeah.
So you can give it a go if you think.
Yeah. No, as I said, I think, you know, if I can get at least debugging, you know, put together. I said I'm not, you know, going to delve into writing a bunch of code, but I'm at least going to go and delve into how I can debug this thing when it breaks. I mean, I've had to go and patch the CF CLI, you know, to give me some of the things I needed to at least view the, redacted variables that I needed to see. So.
I'm curious about your original use case. If you could speak to that, like you said, the original impetus of this is rate limiting.
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about the apps in question and why rate limiting was a requirement? Or
we have a lot of applications that were beating Cloud Foundry applications to death.
mm-hmm.
And I wanted to insulate the cluster from those applications. They were out of cluster, right? And once again, putting in a rate limiting service was doable, but that created the double, hop through Go routers, which doubled the calls, right? Put even more load on the Go routers than was needed. So I wanted to insulate that completely, almost like a denial of service thing. Now I could have done that in HA proxy, of course, and there was a brute sort of force way of doing it. But what I liked about Istio was I could then do inspection on who's doing the call, and I could dynamically change those rates, right? I'm not going to say you've got 3,000 calls per minute allocated, where I could say, right, I'm seeing that you're calling me, but in a burst, right? I could smooth that burst out. So I needed the more dynamic capabilities of rate limiting. In fact, we've seen a lot of applications, especially new ones coming in, new clusters and on cloud native sort of like Kubernetes deployments, looking at more dynamic rate limiting, and not from Istio, but from the Solo distribution that we have, because we have a partnership with Solo. So we're using their rate limiting, and teams are looking at actively rate limiting. So, unfortunately, it seems brain dead simple to everybody, but it seems, it just turns out to be complex. So.
Yeah. I'm guessing from the shape of your test deployment, you haven't actually tested this thing under load at all.
Right. No, this thing is what I've got right now, is definitely not going to handle load.
Right.
But as I said, that's something we can definitely look into it, over time. I just don't see that, that the Kubernetes clusters, I think, can handle it. But as I said, the transformation and so forth. So the WASM stuff doesn't work at load.
Gotcha.
Fantastic. Well, if there are no other thoughts on this at the moment, and there are no other topics, we can probably wrap it up. I'd say keep this line of thought open and discuss it. We have the Slack channels and the repos you can drop issues on and all sorts of stuff. So we'd love to have that engagement and kind of see what's going on and how people are using it. So I want to thank you for putting in all that effort to create a set of slides and the demo and all that. It's just awesome. So thank you kindly.
Anytime you guys have got questions, it's just steven.taylor@sap.com. So
cool. Awesome. Well, it looks like I might be able to give you all about 20 minutes back, which would be great for everyone, depending on where you are doing whatever. So yeah, unless there are any pressing concerns that someone wants to raise their hand for, I want to say thank you all so much for coming out for this. This was cool. I love to see demos, so if you have ones you want to do in the future, please come out and do it. But otherwise, wish you all a great couple of weeks, and we'll meet up again in a bit.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right.